Good afternoon and welcome to this session on Pakistan. In a sense, Pakistan is a country that we tend to see in India primarily from a very India-centric perspective, right? I mean, there's a sort of whole history, politics, legacy to that story. But in this session, what we really want to do is to at least start by looking at Pakistan and its current position in its own terms before we sort of turn towards India-related stuff. And Pakistan is today at this very interesting conjuncture where there is a new political dispensation in power, there is a raging economic crisis, there is all kinds of geopolitical realignments happening in and around Pakistan, all of which have obviously a great bearing on the country's external orientation. Maybe I could start by asking Farzana to say, do you foresee the ascent of Imran Khan? I know you're doing a session on Imran Khan tomorrow, so I don't want to draw you too much into him, but does this new political moment, along with the economic crisis, in this geopolitical context, signify the beginning of some new chapter in Pakistan's external orientation?
Well, I think Imran Khan would like us to believe that what we have ahead of us is Naya Pakistan, new Pakistan. But getting to that goal is, by all accounts, going to be very difficult. His vision of a new Pakistan came with hefty promises, which raised popular expectations. But as Srinath has just said, those expectations are unlikely to be met in the short to medium term, precisely because of Pakistan's dire economic crisis. We have a $12 billion hole in our balance of payments account, a hole that Pakistan will need to fill. Imran Khan himself has acknowledged that Pakistan is, quote, in a desperate situation. It has finally gone, or at least is on the verge of going to the IMF for the 13th time since independence for a bailout. But what Imran Khan is also trying to do is to minimize the size of that bailout, because that bailout is likely to come with strict conditionalities, which Imran Khan feels could well scupper his reform program for Pakistan. And that, of course, has meant that Pakistan has been led to seek the assistance of its long-standing friend China, Saudi Arabia, and possibly some of the Gulf states. But we are really yet to see whether or not those offers of assistance amount to enough to allow Imran Khan to move ahead with his reform program. I think I'll just leave it there for the time being, because we will be talking about foreign policy and domestic politics later. But at the moment, the outlook for Pakistan is undeniably grim.
Part of the challenge which Pakistan seems to face today, and Alyssa, you might want to come in here, is that the relationship with the United States is also at some kind of a cusp, and the Trump administration has taken a pretty tough stance on getting Pakistan to take sort of accountability for acts of terrorism emanating out of its soil, for demanding greater cooperation in dealing with the Taliban. And clearly the United States is still the biggest player in the IMF context, right? So, and we've already seen Secretary Pompeo saying that we're going to sort of push for some strict kind of monitoring of Pakistan's overall finances, in particular its relationship with China, about what kind of debts it already has on its books and so on. So how do you think the current state of US-Pakistan relationship is going to map onto this economic crisis, and where do we see things going?
Earlier, when the crisis first became visible in August, Secretary Pompeo had said something to the effect of, the United States is not going to vote to allow US taxpayers to bail out Pakistan so it can repay loans to China. That was his famous quote about this issue, and it suggested that we might be in a space where the United States would no longer support an economic bailout for Pakistan. Now, I don't know to what extent the administration may still be thinking that way. It is also possible, given what Farzana just said, that Pakistan may find itself in a situation where it does not actually need to seek support from the IMF if it can receive enough from Saudi Arabia and from China. That is one possibility. But what has become clear is that the deteriorating relationship between Pakistan and the United States is forcing us into yet another one of the downslopes in the constant roller coaster of the US-Pakistan relationship. Now, I would argue that certainly the Trump administration has spent a lot of time focusing on the terrorism issue and being quite firm on cutting US security assistance to Pakistan, finding that they hadn't done enough to combat terrorism emanating from its soil. I would argue that you saw the beginnings of this tougher approach in the last year of the Obama administration. So I think that this is a kind of general trend in US-Pakistan ties, where you see a general American dissatisfaction with what people feel is a lack of serious effort to manage or to prevent Pakistani territory from being used to support terrorism or, frankly, from abetting terrorist groups writ large. So you saw in 2016, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter declining to certify that Pakistan was taking sufficient actions against the Haqqani network. That lack of certification created under U.S. law the withholding of about $300 million in assistance from Pakistan. What the Trump administration has done is say, you know what, we're not seeing enough action on terror. We're going to withhold all forms of security assistance. So that is also leading to some of the economic constraint on Pakistan. Because the U.S. is no longer providing the kind of assistance that it was previously. So that's another aspect of this. I do not see U.S.-Pakistan ties finding a resolution to this question anytime soon, because the structural factors that have created the context where the state refuses to act significantly against these terrorist groups, I just don't see them deciding tomorrow that it's going to be in their interest to do so. In fact, we just saw, as some of us were discussing earlier, we just saw 2 days ago that Pakistan has decided they are no longer going to prohibit one name of the Lashkar-e-Taiba. So, you know, they're kind of going softer on the level of banning of these groups, which are under a UN prohibition. It's not just the United States. So this is not heading in a positive direction.
Yeah, we'll come back to the question of US-Pakistan relations, particularly in the context of Afghanistan, and I'd like your views there. But if you can just stay with this thought of how is Pakistan going to sort of weather this particular crisis, right? So we saw Imran Khan has recently reached out to the Saudis, and they've apparently pledged $3 billion sort of worth of deferred payments for oil. He's making some similar attempts with the UAE. Neena, you worked in the region, you know the region extensively well. This is also a moment when the Saudis are themselves feeling quite a bit of heat following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Do you think Saudi Arabia is in a position to sort of step up really and bail Pakistan out on its own terms?
I think a bailout is not even in a question, because it's like a payment which they expect to get back. Out of the 6 billion, 3 billion has to be paid back within a year. So I don't think the Saudis are there for the long term. But ideologically, the Saudis have always supported Pakistan as being a Islamic state in South Asia. And I think that is what the connection is between the Saudis and the Pakistanis. And that has never been broken, right through the Taliban days when Saudis and the UAE supported Taliban, as did Pakistan. So I think the circle, I think it's come full circle right now, because the Taliban, Pakistan-supported Taliban, is actually back in contention with the United States. I found that fascinating, that Alice Wells, such a senior official in the U.S. administration, would hold back-channel talks with the Taliban, Pakistan-supported Taliban, in Qatar. Which itself is very odd, because Qatar is on the wrong side of history vis-a-vis the Saudis. But I think the point that I want to make is why does America look at it only through an economic point of view? It's actually the whole ideological connection, the Islamic connection between the Pakistanis and the Saudis and the Afghans is where they need to actually apply their mind and realize they're being taken for a ride. This is a great big Pakistani lie that has been saying that it is Afghan-led and Afghan whatever. It's not Afghan-led at all. The Afghans, right through Obama and through Clinton and Trump, the Taliban has been making huge, basically by annihilating the opposition, but taking over the Afghan countryside. And as you rightly said, Alyssa, they control the borderlands so that they actually are the people who can destroy American soldiers, American camps, even, the British camps in Helmand. All of them have been backed by the Pakistanis. So the potential for Pakistan to destroy, peace in Afghanistan is huge. And I think that's where the Saudis should be, controlled. And I have no idea how it's going to happen, because in the Middle East they've been running amok. They've created this alliance with groups which are ISIS and so on and so forth, and seen to it that there's this whole arc of instability that runs through the Middle East, and it's basically because of the Saudis. So that's where I'd like to.
Okay, but the Saudi-Pakistan connection, as you said, is not just about sort of support financially and so on. There is an ideological connection. Farzana, I'd like you to come here. There is a wider connection between Pakistan and the Middle East, at least going back to the decade of the 1970s when oil becomes important. There is a huge, chain of migration between Pakistan and the Middle East. And in that context, how important do you think is the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the region as a whole, actually?
Well, I think it's an open secret that Saudi Arabia has long acted as an eminence grise in the politics of Pakistan, a fact that was acknowledged by its ambassador during the WikiLeaks disclosures. So I think there is some understanding that Saudi Arabia plays quite an important part in the conduct of Pakistani politics. Now, the relations between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, as we've just heard, do go back several decades. But I think they really came into gear in the 1970s, the early 1970s, after the breakup of the country. When it was widely believed that the two-nation theory, which had stood as the raison d'être of the state, had come apart. And in response to that, it was felt that Pakistan needed, as it were, to tighten its ideological moorings and sharpen its Islamic profile. That had two consequences. One, it loosened Pakistan's ties to the more pluralistic cultures of South Asia, with which, of course, its peoples have long been connected, and on the other, tightened bonds with countries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states. There were, of course, strong economic bonds that were growing at the same time, which accentuated the strength of these ties. There's a huge Pakistani labor force that was sent out in the 1970s to seek employment in the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. But I suppose really the turning point came under the military regime of General Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s, when Pakistan experienced one of the most systematic programs of Islamization under General Zia-ul-Haq. It also, of the Afghan civil war, the outbreak of the Afghan civil war, with Saudi Arabia playing a big part with local mujahideen groups, aided and abetted by Pakistan and I might say the United States to try and defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And altogether this lent huge impetus to the Saudi presence in Pakistan. But it was really not until the 1990s that Pakistan and many Pakistanis realized the full consequences of that presence in the steady transformation of Pakistani society, a society that many believe became much more prone to forms of religious extremism, prone to violence, to achieve religious ends. The proliferation of madrasas or Quranic schools, helped, backed and financed by Saudi Arabia, promoting versions of Islam which were judged to be much narrower than the broadly Sufi-informed varieties of Islam that existed in Pakistan. Together, they have led us to believe that, in fact, Pakistan society as it stands today bears little or no resemblance to the kind of Pakistan that existed prior to the 1970s. And many blame, or at least hold responsible, not just Saudi Arabia, but the connivance of successive Pakistani governments in kowtowing and allying and cooperating with Saudi Arabia, no doubt for pragmatic reasons, which we can go into later, into strengthening these bonds, the effects of which have been nothing short of nefarious in Pakistan.
So there is another angle also to Pakistani involvement with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, right? Which is that Pakistan is something of a security provider, at least to ensure internal stability. We've seen Pakistani brigades sort of operating under Ziaul Haq, back in the day in countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, a lot of the Emiratis, at least to maintain their internal control, especially against sort of unrestful minorities, have relied on Pakistani armed forces to act as the sort of a extended sword arm of the state. That's another dimension to that.
Absolutely, that security relationship is very important, but it is a relationship that is contested. And the reason why I say that is because, as some of you will know, the Saudi-led military alliance, which many regard as being anti-Iran, is being led by the former head of Pakistan's military, General Raheel Sharif. Now, Pakistan's National Assembly under the previous government had voted against any kind of formal Pakistani involvement in this alliance. Pakistan has a huge sectarian problem on its hands, a sectarian problem that has pitted its dominant Sunni majority against its Shia minority, who are quite a sizable minority, 25%, it is said, of the total Muslim population of Pakistan. And Pakistan, there are many in Pakistan who feel that this sectarian problem could become much worse if Pakistan got sucked into this regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the National Assembly, as I said, voted against any kind of Pakistani participation in that alliance. But that resolution and its decision was overruled, presumably by our dominant military, which gave permission to General Raheel Sharif to go to Saudi Arabia and take what is arguably the most important security job in the region today.
Yeah. And then, Alyssa, I think it's fair to say that the main fault line in the Middle East today is basically of the Arab states versus Iran in a kind of a geopolitical competition, which has obviously sort of aspects of identity, religion, etc. built into it. And it seems to me that the United States has picked one side very clearly in this. President Trump has tried to cement this extraordinary relationship with Saudi Arabia, and then the effort is very much to contain Iran. And he has taken steps such as sort of tearing up the sort of nuclear agreement which the 5 countries had negotiated with Iran on the Iranian nuclear program. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the cumulative implication of this turn, on the one hand to tighten the screws on Pakistan, make it more accountable, etc. On the other hand, to antagonize Iran by saying that an agreement which had been negotiated in good faith is now torn up. How do you think these two things are going to impact on the US presence in Afghanistan? Because if there are two countries which are capable of making life extremely difficult for the United States in Afghanistan, it's Pakistan and Iran. What sense does it make for an American administration to take them on simultaneously while you are saying that you actually want to stabilize the country?
I think a lot of people in the United States have asked that question precisely. It definitely introduces yet another hurdle towards finding some possible solution in the region. I think it makes it very, very difficult to find a solution for stability in the region. And that's going to be, I think, the real conundrum here. It has been true as long as the United States has been involved in Afghanistan that Pakistan has placed a great hurdle towards success, towards military success in Afghanistan. I think that is undeniable, and everybody in the United States has come to that conclusion more or less. And so what you see happening now are different approaches to try to find a solution. Now, the Trump administration has resuscitated the idea of trying to find a negotiated solution with the Taliban. I am not that optimistic that this will come to pass. I think many people might see this as a highly unlikely solution, but it's one that they are pursuing to give diplomacy a shot, because it's pretty clear that military success is also quite far off. So not being able to look for a buffer with Iran places yet another hurdle. It places, by the way, I think as many here would appreciate, a bit of a challenge for India's relationship in being that economic assistance actor in Afghanistan. India is the 5th largest bilateral donor. And the Trump administration to Afghanistan, the Trump administration does recognize that. In fact, with its South Asia strategy, asking India specifically to play an even more positive role as a development partner to Afghanistan. Now, the challenge here is, how well can India do that if the United States is pressing countries around the world to end their relationships, their economic lines to Iran? There is a clause in the legislation on Iran sanctions. When the United States pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what that meant is that under U.S. law, we revert to the sanctions that had been in place in 2012. There is a clause in that legislation that allows for engagement with Iran such that it supports economic development and assistance in Afghanistan. So I think the Chabahar component of this question will be probably okay. There are larger questions about its viability. But the United States is continuing to ask India to reduce its oil procurements from Iran, and that component of the conversation is going to continue to create tension there. So you're absolutely right. You've got kind of two countries that are in a position to be supportive or very unsupportive, and we now do not really have the support of either. So it's not a scenario that leads you to conclude that within a time delimited period, let's say 1 year, we don't have a very good solution lined out.
No, that's right. And I think the problem is not just about oil imports from Iran, but also the financial sanctions on the Iranian sort of financial system, right? It's going to make Indian companies, Indian government very wary of sort of financial transactions with Iran, which was the situation before 2014. So I think it is going to be a very tricky spot for India to be in.
That's absolutely right. It'll be interesting to see how the diplomacy on this front continues to unfold. There have been high-level visits from the United States to India, too, to discuss the energy issues, as we saw.
Yeah. So, Neena, you mentioned about this sort of attempt by the Trump administration to reach out to the Taliban through their office in Qatar. And we know that in the past, the Obama administration has also tried that same avenue. Alyssa seems to suggest that the prospects of that going forward aren't particularly strong. Some of the reporting actually suggests that the Afghan president was kept out of the loop before the talks happened, and in a sense they themselves learnt of it subsequently. So what was your sense of the prospects for that kind of a, is it a viable strategy for the United States to cut Pakistan, even the Afghan government, out of a negotiation with Taliban or bring them in at a later stage? Is that going to work? Do you think Pakistan will cooperate, go along with this stuff?
See, Pakistan has always wanted a friendly government in Afghanistan, right from the very beginning. I mean, they worked actively to undermine Najibullah for reasons, obviously because they were part of that anti-communist move. But even when they had a friendly government in Mullah Omar and so on and so forth, they did have difficulty handling that government. If you remember, I mean, those were interviews. I remember the people who went to interview Mullah Omar were always treated as if they were pariahs. And Pakistani journalists, barring a few, were always given a lecture on how Afghanistan should be run by Afghans. So even at that point, I think the Pakistan's ability to control the Taliban was mixed. They funded them, and all of that. But right now, I think what's happened with the US is that they don't, I think, get the depth of the strength of the Pakistanis to disrupt Afghanistan. I mean, for example, these elections which were just held in Afghanistan, I mean, 5 of the people who were, candidates, Afghan candidates, were killed just within 10 days of the polls. So I think the crux of this is that Afghanistan is not going to be easy to handle. Whether they manage to get it through President Ghani or Karzai. Karzai apparently did reach out to the Taliban many times, and that's one of the reasons they say that the pro-India head of the Afghan intelligence was sacked by Karzai, and and the same thing happened again with Ghani, where all his ministers resigned because he was reaching out to the Taliban. I think the move by Pakistan to bring back Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, for instance, was a very, very clever move because he was their man for such a long time and supported and backed and so on and so forth. So I think it's still a work in progress, and I think we'll have to wait and see how it plays out in the next coming months, because Ghani apparently I've heard is very ill, and that they are trying to see that they get a successor in. But who that successor will be is interesting. Yeah. And all of this, what I found the most fascinating is that Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was, the greatest, supported by India and backed by India, his son is back in Kabul. He's actually been back in Kabul for at least the last year, and there's not a peep from him. So, that whole Northern Alliance which India supported is also in disarray.
Right. So, the one country which, in a sense, has become a lot more important to Pakistan, Afghanistan arguably, and even the Middle East in some ways, in a sense, is China, right? And Farzana, as you know, the the Pakistan-China relationship goes at least back to the early 1960s when they began the boundary negotiations. They managed to conclude those negotiations successfully at a time when India and China were fighting each other. Subsequently, that relationship has expanded. Pakistan played a very important role in enabling the United States to normalize its relations with the People's Republic of China. And in a sense, I think if you look at it from the Chinese point of view, you could make a good case that the relationship with Pakistan has been the one alliance that has really worked for China over the long term. No other relationship, whether it was the Soviet Union, the United States, Vietnam, everything has kind of had its ups and downs. Pakistan has been pretty steady. And in the last decade, at least my reading would be that the relationship has actually deepened in considerably important ways. We were talking about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but also, if that stuff comes through, it's going to give China the first sort of overland access to the Indian Ocean. All of it is extremely important for the Chinese. So is China really the now new United States for Pakistan? I mean, is
No. It's true that this relationship goes back. It goes back to the 1960s. It certainly developed momentum under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was a great advocate of closer relations between Pakistan and China. But in recent months, there have been signs that this relationship too could be coming under strain. And here I refer, of course, to the feeling within sections of Pakistani society that the main reason for Pakistan's debt problem arises from these huge loans that have been made by China to Pakistan to further this economic project we all know as the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And Imran Khan's party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, during its campaigning days, during the time when it was in opposition, raised several questions about the lack of transparency governing the China-Pakistan economic corridor project, claiming that the grounds on which these loans were secured were never really open to public scrutiny. And one of the things that his party insisted on, or at least promised to do when it came to power, was precisely to open up for public scrutiny the basis on which China's economic assistance was being made available to Pakistan. Now, since taking power, Imran Khan has run into a few difficulties, because although he has wanted, in some sense, to open CPEC to public debate, something which has really not happened to date. I mean, until quite recently, if you questioned the merits of CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, if you questioned its merits, you came close to being seen as anti-Pakistan. It is seen as something that is so integral to Pakistan's welfare that to question it, as I said, was to question your standing as a loyal citizen of Pakistan. That seems to have receded somewhat, but Imran Khan has found, upon taking power, that of course, as we talked about earlier, Pakistan finds itself in dire economic straits and must turn to its friends for help, including China. There has also been talk, of course, as we know, about Pakistan going to the IMF for a bailout. But one of the conditions that the IMF set on any agreement with Pakistan was precisely to open up those books on CPEC to the scrutiny of the IMF, because, as Alyssa was saying, the United States, which is the major contributor to the IMF, has made it very clear that the IMF is not going to subsidize Pakistan to pay off China's loans or pay off debts to China. So Pakistan really finds itself in a very difficult position. There have also been mutterings within Pakistan's business community, and indeed one of Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan's closest economic advisors, drawn from Pakistan's business community, that warned of these ties crippling Pakistan's economy and being detrimental to Pakistan business. So, you know, there have been mutterings. There are questions now being raised. The Chinese are aware of this. Just in the last 24 hours, we've heard China come out very clearly, senior Chinese officials saying that China is not to blame for Pakistan's economic problems, and that China is a friend which has Pakistan's interests to heart. So China is really bending over backwards to dismiss what it has described as, quote, lies about CPEC. So this relationship is coming under strain, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. So I must add that where it goes will depend very largely on Pakistan's military, which of course is heavily paid up to CPEC, which is mainly an infrastructural project, massive infrastructural project. And of course, as we know, the Pakistan army, which has developed huge stakes in Pakistan's economy, specializes in infrastructure. So there's plenty to lose economically for the military. And the military has been keen to try and keep this relationship on an even keel. And if you ask me, if there is one point of potential strain between Imran Khan and Pakistan's military, it's very likely to be over CPEC.
Okay. So, Alyssa, no conversation about Pakistan and India can work without asking this sort of now more or less tired old question, but still worth revisiting, of saying, what is it going to take to get Pakistan's external orientation to change, right? Farzana has rightly pointed out the sort of preponderance of the military, its imperatives in controlling the interests of the state, and so on. Sitting in India, the successive Indian governments have tried various kinds of things. You've tried comprehensive engagement, you've tried disengagement, you've apparently tried military strikes. There are all kinds of things. But do you see any of this external sort of context which is changing, especially all the stuff that we've discussed with the sort of a tougher policy from India, really leading towards some kind of a change of behavior as far as Pakistan is concerned, vis-a-vis India, Afghanistan, and possibly an attempt to, really tap into the potential of the country? We only need to sort of compare Pakistan with Bangladesh, right? I mean, both countries which started from exactly the same baseline, but Bangladesh is doing so much better in every human, index.
I think it's overtaken Pakistan in per capita income, which was
exactly
the one indicator.
So what is it that is going to take for Pakistan to do, this kind of a reorientation to say, shouldn't we be putting the interests of our people first ahead of this kind of a policy of saying that we need to play this outsized role in various parts of our neighborhood? So.
Well, if you're looking to me for the good news story on this question, I'm afraid I don't have it. It's very difficult to see the country's external orientation changing in the near or even medium term. And I will be blunt, I think it's hard to see that happening under an Imran Khan-led government, precisely because the conditions under which he came to power in the country were precisely those that required the backing of the military. So it's very unlikely that he would be willing to try to reset civil-military balance in the country, to lead it to be able to prioritize economic development, for example, to lead it in another direction. So there is a theoretical scenario in which citizens of the country say, why can't we have a better outcome for ourselves, for our own potential? But right now it doesn't look as if we're going to see that anytime in the near term.
Neena, do you think India's policy of putting Pakistan in the doghouse is really going to change things?
I think it's the most disastrous policy that I've seen in the last 30 years. I mean, if you could have Vajpayee drive up to Lahore in a bus when the Jamaat-e-Islami were, burning effigies and so on and so forth, why should this policy be no talking until terrorism ends? Terrorism is not going to end. I mean, that's a fact. So does that mean that we don't talk to Pakistan at all? I think Modi...
No, but the government would say that, listen, how do you expect us to justify a policy of engaging with Pakistan when acts of terrorism are being conducted against Indian citizens, right? Every government is sensitive to domestic politics. You just can't expect us to do. I mean, I don't agree with them, but I'm saying that's the framing.
But we did try, right? I mean, Modi did try. I mean, he did fly unscheduled stopover in Lahore when he went for Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding. What was that about? That has never been explained to the people at large. Why did he make that trip? And then you had Pathankot, you had Uri, and then you had these series of these cross-border attacks. But the point is the Pakistan army and the Indian army have always had a back channel, have always spoken. The National Security Advisor, Doval, has had that with Janjua. He talked to Janjua, I don't know how many meetings they had in Bangkok and Dubai and so on and so forth. So I think the idea is not to make Pakistan the enemy, because the connection between Pakistanis and Indians is so strong. I mean, some of my best friends are Pakistanis. The music that we hear, the language that we speak, the poetry, all of that are the things that we make our countries work. So I don't understand the demonizing of Pakistan to the extent that has happened under this administration. It's a no. It's not going to take us anywhere. You know, Modi should have kept talks alive with Nawaz Sharif. Now that Nawaz Sharif is gone, Imran Khan has tried twice. What did we lose? What would we have lost if Sushma Swaraj had a chat with
Sure.
with SMQ,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
Shah Mahmood Qureshi? We would have lost nothing.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and we would have looked like as if we were the bigger, country, the larger-hearted people.
We are almost out of time, but Farzana, you should logically have the last word. What do you think it's going to take to get Pakistan to reorient its
Well, Pakistan, of course, it's a turbulent state with turbulent politics, very, very fractured national identity. But I think one thing that can be said is that Pakistan, from 1947 and the creation of the state, has been consistent on two points, and these have not shifted, and I don't see any shift, certainly in my lifetime. One, it will not kowtow to India, and two, it will not settle for anything less than a recognizably friendly government in Afghanistan.
And
I think that's a lovely place to end this panel discussion. I think that's been fantastic.